This is apropos. Well, French prosecutors say they've identified 5 people suspected of threatening the judges involved in the trial of far-right leader Marine Le Pen. She and her supporters have been accusing the judiciary of deploying a nuclear bomb aimed at derailing her presidential ambitions since her conviction on Monday for embezzlement. The judge who barred her from running for office is now under police protection after facing death threats and having her home address shared online. As August Hackinson explains, it's far from the first time the far right has launched assaults on judicial independence.
Death threats and home addresses leaked online. The 3 judges who convicted Marine Le Pen and banned her from public office have faced severe online harassment, with the head of the panel now under 24/7 police protection. By Thursday, 5 suspects had been identified in connection with the threats, according to a Paris prosecutor. Monday's ruling sparked outrage among Le Pen supporters, fueled by party officials.
A handful of prosecutors and judges used the law to exercise the system's vendetta against its only opposition, the National Rally, and against the main face of it, Marine Le Pen. Some tyrannies jail the opposition. Now we have judges here acting like tyrants.
But frustration over the verdict wasn't limited to the far right. Prime Minister François Bayrou said he was troubled by the 5-year ban, a sentiment echoed by the far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon. President Emmanuel Macron, for his part, defended the judiciary's independence and insisted the judges must be protected. Unions called on politicians to stop attacking the courts.
Yeah, and there is a political responsibility of everybody in office within the parliament, the government, when they say and when they attack judges as well, because it will spread within the society.
The increasingly heated rhetoric comes as the far right plans a massive rally in Paris on Sunday in support of Le Pen. National Rally's leader Jordan Bardella insisted on Thursday that it is not to be seen as a violent attempt to challenge the judiciary.
Well, for more, we're joined now by Andrew Smith. He's a lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London. Thanks so much, Andrew, for being with us on the programme this evening. As we heard there in that report, suspects identified now who have been threatening judges involved in Marine Le Pen's case, those threats being made online. Do you think people in general are being emboldened to make these kinds of threats by what they're hearing and seeing their political leaders do and say?
It's a real challenge, isn't it? That venomization of rhetoric, that real intensification of language, the discrediting of Republican institutions, and really trying to call into question people's faith in democracy. That's the kind of thing that emboldens people, really, as you say, to make quite dangerous threats at times. Now, we've seen this already connected to this case back in January. After the first round of the case, there were a number of threats posted online that French police investigated. You had, calls for putting a 9mm bullet in the back of the judge's head. There were other, massed videos of people calling for people to be eliminated. That's really frightening rhetoric, and it has no place in any democratic politics. And again, what we're seeing here is some really targeted, vicious threats which are against named individuals. Now, it's one thing to be displeased with the judgment. It's one thing to be, unhappy with the way something's turned out. But I think the moment that, really people start using this rhetoric in the assembly, like far-right deputies talking about a republic of judges, talking about, them having political motivations, that's not what's happening. And what we've seen actually is, judges carrying out their job according to sentencing guidelines. This is not, there's no targeting. Marine Le Pen has neither seen, fear nor favour as a result of her position. She's been treated much like the other 23, those convicted alongside her, and like others before her, François Fillon, Nicolas Sarkozy, Alain Juppé, other leaders from left and right. So really, I think that is something quite dangerous here, where that, real ramping up of rhetoric, that discrediting of Republican institutions, emboldens people really to have a go at them, but not just in a sort of, back and forth political banter kind of way, but in a targeted, violent way. And that's the real worry. When we've got, threatened rallies on the street to defend politicians. You know, when you've got this idea of all the rest of it, it reeks of 1934, of, the idea of kind of political violence in the streets, and a real terror around this as well. And I think there's a lot to be said for trying to ramp down that rhetoric, point to the law as it stands, and just show where this is just due process. A criminal has been convicted and subject to a sentence. They are appealing, and that's fair game.
And Andrew, we're also seeing, though, what might be called as a bit of mixed messaging coming from the French government itself. The president, he's saying that on the one hand, judges must be protected. He said that to his cabinet ministers this week. But as we saw in that report, we're even hearing that, sources close to the Prime Minister expressing unease about this, former senior ministers as well, before we had the verdict, saying that they were hoping that this was not going to be the outcome. So what do you make of the message actually coming from the government?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the first thing to point out is, of course, the president has come out and defended the independence of the judiciary. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think actually some of that sort of, you might say, back and forth, some of that inconsistency comes from the independence of these different arms of the state, the independence of the judiciary, of the executive, and of the legislative. That's what's bringing out this debate. Now, of course, François Bayrou, the Prime Minister, has frequently differed from the President in terms of his approaches. They are sort of old-time political allies, but they've never always been kind of, in lockstep in terms of what they're doing in terms of politics. And Bayrou has at times sort of angered the President in recent weeks around different stances. I think for the Prime Minister, and sources close to them, they'll have been hoping that this judgment hadn't come down because it's a political headache. And we saw the scenes in your footage in the Assembly of far-right deputies standing up, accusing the government of corruption, accusing the judges of having political motivations. Nobody wants to see that kind of language, those kind of accusations in politics. And actually, this is one of the real problems, I think, in terms of this attempt to denigrate the institutions of the Republic. I think what you've seen already is the very first people that came out to support Marine Le Pen and the far-right Front National, the National Rally. I say that almost because it's echoing now this language of the Front National, even though they've rebranded. Suddenly, that violent rhetoric of doing down democracy, of accusing justices of corruption, that's the kind of language we associate with not the de-diabolized safe image that the National Rally has tried to put across, but much more like the National Front of Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. That sounds much more like that rhetoric. And I think that's the real challenge, seeing them sort of unmask themselves again, come out against democratic institutions, and go looking for support to the Kremlin, to other illiberal far-right politicians across Europe. That really shows us, I think, that nothing much has changed. There's been no de-diabolisation, no detoxification of that party. It's really just a PR game.
And you mentioned the Kremlin there, Andrew. How does all of this compare to other kind of friction that we've seen elsewhere outside France over judges who are forced to adjudicate thorny political questions?
Well, I think that's a real challenge. And again, what we've seen is, what you might call a kind of nationalist international or a reactionary international. Of course, the people that came out to support Marine Le Pen were Kremlin spokespeople, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Matteo Salvini, in Italy, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, a whole kind of galaxy of far-right or liberal spokespeople looking to kind of, really to prioritise popular democracy over the institutions of the Republic. And I think that's one of the big challenges. One of the things we're seeing, even playing out in American politics right now, is that democracy is on a very weak footing without judges. This is not a case of judges against democracy. It's recognizing that an independent judiciary is at the heart of what democracy has to be. The idea of, not just letting the ballot box be the one thing that controls everything is because actually it's so powerful that we need checks and balances. We need states that protect democratic institutions from sudden moments of, rupture and excitement, as we can see on the other side of the Atlantic right now. And I think that's really where we can see some of these difficulties. And it's also one of the cautions I would have around that envenoming of the rhetoric politically in France. Previously, we've seen moments where there is political tension in France, ratcheted up by foreign interference. We saw, of course, that Operation Doppelganger back when the Israeli invasion of Gaza took place. That idea of ratcheting up tensions, often linked by interest to the Kremlin or people associated, is another thing that actually seeing this division, this violence, this sort of chaos in politics is something that is only really a tonic for those who are no friend of the Republic. And so I think it's a really important time to look at judges are, in fact, a part of the democratic apparatus of the state. They are some of the people that defend and guarantee democracy. And that's why I think it's so important, as the President has said, to defend an independent judiciary and resist any attempts to try and, really target them on a personal basis.
And on a practical level, Andrew, how exactly do you protect the judicial system and judges? Because we're even seeing in the UK, this isn't just coming down to the far right. The Shadow Justice Secretary criticising a senior judge in the House of Commons, prompting a rebuke from the Attorney General, as you've mentioned as well. We're seeing it in the United States with Donald Trump also.
Well, it's a really challenging one. Again, the first recourse you would think would be legal. But of course, it's one of these problems that you can't really, you can't find the solution sometimes through the problem. I think some of the difficulty has to be around the responsibility of elected politicians. I think there has to be standards of behaviour in the Assembly. I think there has to be expectations and sanctions when people breach those. I think likewise there has to be active policing to look where there are credible threats. It's one thing to say you don't like somebody. It's one thing to say you disagree with something. It's quite another thing entirely to say you want to put a 9mm bullet in someone's head. That's unacceptable. I think where you start to target those things, make those threats credible and personal, I think that's where the law needs to come in and prosecute those types of kind of infraction. As people say about free speech and all the rest of it, my freedom to swing my arm ends at the tip of your nose. You can't use language and free speech to constantly make violent threats that are targeted against individuals, especially when it's just people doing their job. And so I think there has to be, first of all, greater standards of behaviour from elected politicians, greater responsibility. Second of all, clear policing and sentencing guidelines around what online communications do and where they represent credible threats to violence. We're not talking about hurty words or anything like that. We're talking about threats to murder someone. That's unacceptable. Those types of things, I think, are what we need to look for. And it needs to come from the top, and it needs to be ratcheted down in the Assembly. You can't have people doing down judges and tearing at democracy just for the sake of one individual's political career. That is not patriotism. That is selfishness and childishness. And it's a delusion to say that this is some kind of political targeting. Sure, it's a headache the Prime Minister might have wanted to live without, but it's a moment where actually the trial has done its job. The justice has been served. A criminal has been convicted. They have a right to appeal. That appeal will be heard. We hear that it's going to take place in the summer of 2026. Justice should be swift, it should be transparent, and it should be equal before the law. Those are some of the tenets of 1789 and the Republic itself. And I think it's important that we live up to those, even today.
Andrew, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much. That's Andrew Smith from Queen Mary University of London. That's it from us for now. We'll be right back.